Everyone saw the paper taped to his front gate, but no one dared to ask what it meant. It was bold in red ink, almost like a warning. Violation, fine $100. At first glance, neighbors thought maybe it was about weeds or a forgotten trash can. After all, that's how the HOA usually worked in their quiet Arizona neighborhood. But the truth was so much stranger and so much more painful than anyone could imagine. Because this man wasn't being punished for neglect or for breaking rules. He was being punished for kindness. David Morales never wanted attention. He was an ordinary man in his 50s with sun-worn skin, a faded ball cap, and a habit of keeping his promises. For years, he had worked construction under the blazing Arizona heat. He knew what it was like to be thirsty, to feel the burn in your throat, the dizziness creeping in when the sun just wouldn't let up. And maybe that's why he began setting out a cooler of ice water at the edge of his driveway. Nothing fancy. Just a simple blue chest filled with bottles, free for anyone walking by. Hikers, delivery drivers, kids riding bikes, even strangers driving through would sometimes stop, surprised to see the hand-painted sign, "Free water, stay cool." It wasn't charity, it was survival. Arizona summers kill people. David knew that. He'd seen too many news reports of neighbors, tourists, even elderly folks collapsing in the heat. He wanted no part of that on his conscience. But good deeds have a way of drawing shadows. And David's shadow came in the form of the HOA, the neighborhood's homeowners association, a board known for measuring lawns with rulers, counting parked cars, and demanding fines for the smallest missteps. At first, they ignored him. The cooler sat there day after day, a small act of rebellion against a world that sometimes forgot compassion. Then came the first letter. Unauthorized signage, $100 fine. David laughed bitterly when he read it. Unauthorized signage. It was just cardboard and paint, but he paid it anyway, thinking maybe that would end it. It didn't. The second letter came a week later. This time, unapproved structure on property. Another $100. He realized then they weren't going to stop. Neighbors whispered. Some supported him quietly, sneaking by to grab a bottle and murmuring a soft thank you under their breath. Others shook their heads, muttering that rules were rules and maybe the HOA had a point. David heard it all, but he never moved the cooler. Because deep down he believed something bigger was at stake. This wasn't just about water. It was about dignity, humanity, about the right to do one small good thing without being punished for it. But the HOA didn't see it that way. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert sky in flames of orange, David found not one but 3 violation slips fluttering on his gate. Fines stacked like bricks. The message was clear. Remove the cooler or pay until you break. Standing there in the golden light, the papers trembling in his hand, David felt a strange mix of anger and fear. He wasn't a wealthy man. Each $100 cut deep like another piece of flesh taken. But there was something in him that refused to bend. What no one knew yet was how far the HOA was willing to go. And what David was about to uncover, hidden behind closed meetings and quiet threats, would turn a simple cooler of water into the spark of a battle that shook the entire community. Sometimes wars don't start with armies. They start with a glass of water. The whispers started before sunrise. Did you hear? They find him again. Neighbors leaned over fences, voices low, eyes darting toward David's modest beige house at the corner of the cul-de-sac. The cooler still sat there, stubborn as ever, its lid glistening with dew. To some, it was a symbol of defiance. To others, it was a ticking time bomb. But for David, it was simply non-negotiable. People needed water, and he wouldn't be the man who stopped giving it. Still, the fines stacked higher. By the end of the month, the HOA claimed he owed $700. $7 pieces of paper, each one screaming the same word, violation. David tried reasoning with them. He walked into the HOA office one scorching afternoon, hat in his hands, sweat clinging to his back. The room smelled of stale coffee and paperwork. 3 board members sat behind a polished desk, their expressions stiff as granite. "I'm not selling anything," David said quietly but firmly. "It's just water, free water. No signs, no profit, just bottles so folks don't pass out in this heat." The chairwoman leaned back, arms crossed. "Rules are rules, Mr. Morales. Any unapproved display or structure is prohibited, period." Her words echoed in his mind long after he left. Rules are rules. He'd heard that before in school, in the military, on construction sites. And sometimes rules saved lives. But sometimes they strangled the very thing they were supposed to protect. That night, David sat alone on his porch, staring at the stars. His hands were calloused, his wallet thin, and yet his heart told him he couldn't give in. He thought of the mailman who always tipped his cap after grabbing a bottle, the teenager on his skateboard who whispered, "Thanks, mister," the elderly couple who once clutched those waters like medicine. How do you put a price on that? But the HOA wasn't done. They doubled down, sending letters with sharper language, threatening liens on his home if payments weren't made. Neighbors grew uneasy. Some urged him to stop to protect himself. Others grew bold, offering to help stock the cooler when they could. Lines were being drawn, and David was in the middle, whether he wanted to be or not. One morning, just as the cicadas screamed in the heat, David walked outside to refill the cooler and froze. The bottles were gone, not stolen by strangers but confiscated. A bright yellow notice taped across the lid declared, "Removed by order of the HOA." His chest tightened. For a moment he stood there in silence, feeling the kind of hollowness only betrayal can bring. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about control. They wanted to break him. That evening he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of violation slips like they were weapons. His hand trembled, but not from fear, from fury. They could fine him, they could strip the cooler, but they couldn't erase the truth. People needed this water. And then an idea came, a quiet rebellion. The next day, David placed not one but 2 coolers at the edge of his driveway. No signs this time, just plain blue chests filled with bottles. No handwriting to accuse him of advertising. Just water sitting there silently waiting. By sundown, every single bottle was gone. The HOA didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. David wasn't just one man with a cooler anymore. He was becoming a story, a symbol, and in neighborhoods like theirs, symbols spread faster than fire. Still deep down, David wondered, how long could he fight this? And what price would he pay before the truth finally came to light? The sound of children's laughter broke the silence that afternoon. David looked up from his porch to see 3 kids racing their bikes down the street, their cheeks flushed from the heat. They stopped at his driveway, skidding to a halt beside the cooler. When they opened the lid, steam rose from the melting ice, bottles clinking as they grabbed one each. "Thanks, mister," they shouted, pedaling away. David smiled faintly. For a fleeting moment, everything felt worth it. But the illusion shattered when he noticed a car parked across the street. Black sedan, windows tinted, engine running. Inside sat 2 members of the HOA board, clipboards on their laps, eyes locked on him like hawks. They weren't hiding, they wanted him to see. It was intimidation, plain and simple. He raised his bottle of water toward them in a sarcastic toast. They didn't flinch, just scribbled notes and drove off, tires crunching against the asphalt. That night, another envelope arrived. This time, it wasn't a fine, it was a warning. Continued violations may result in legal escalation. Legal, the word gnawed at him. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't rich. He was a working man with bills, debts, and a house barely holding value. They knew that. They were counting on it. And yet something had changed in the neighborhood. Quiet support was turning into visible defiance. A UPS driver honked his horn in solidarity. A woman from down the block left a handwritten note on his porch. "Don't stop, we're with you." David wasn't a leader. He never asked for this fight. But now people were watching him, and through him, they were watching the HOA too. The tension came to a head one blistering Saturday. A neighborhood meeting called by the HOA to discuss ongoing concerns. David almost didn't go, but something inside told him he had to. The community hall buzzed with chatter as folding chairs filled with neighbors fanning themselves with paper programs. At the front, the HOA board sat in a neat row, faces stiff, gavel ready. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "We are here to address repeated violations of neighborhood policy regarding unauthorized displays." Everyone knew who she meant. David stood slowly, his voice calm but steady. "We're talking about water, bottled water, in a desert where people die every year from heat stroke, and you're calling that a violation." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded, some crossed their arms. The chairwoman's face hardened. "This isn't about water," she snapped. "This is about rules. If one homeowner disregards them, the entire community falls apart." David's chest tightened. He could feel every eye on him, waiting. And in that silence, he spoke words that cut sharper than he realized. Maybe the community doesn't fall apart when someone breaks the rules. Maybe it falls apart when compassion is treated like a crime. Gasps, a few claps. Someone shouted, "He's right." The gavel slammed, order. But order was gone. The meeting erupted into voices clashing, neighbors arguing, lines being drawn. Some sided with the board, insisting order mattered above all. Others rallied behind David, furious at the pettiness of punishing kindness. David sat back down, his pulse racing. He hadn't planned to speak like that, it just came out, and now he couldn't take it back. By the end of the night, the board adjourned abruptly, their faces pale with anger. The battle lines had been drawn in public. When David walked out under the hot night air, people gathered around him, patting his shoulder, whispering encouragement. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. But in the shadows across the parking lot, he saw the chairwoman watching him, her lips pressed in a thin smile. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. And David knew the real fight hadn't even begun. The desert wind howled that night, rattling the shutters against David's windows. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the meeting in his mind. Every word he spoke, every clap that followed, every glare from the board. The battle lines weren't just drawn, they were burned into the ground. And when the morning sun rose, David saw the retaliation waiting for him. Spray paint. Across his garage door in thick black letters, "Rule Breaker." His stomach dropped. It was the HOA's style to get their hands dirty, but someone had carried their anger into the night. Neighbors trickled by, whispering. Some gasped in sympathy, others smirked. David stood frozen, rag in hand, scrubbing at the letters until his arms ached. The paint smeared but didn't vanish. And in that moment, he realized something chilling. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. Later that afternoon, a knock rattled his door. He opened it to find the mailman holding a certified letter. Another violation. Another fine. But this one carried a weight heavier than all the rest. Failure to comply may result in lien placement against property. They were threatening his home now. David sank into his chair, the paper trembling in his hands. A lien meant foreclosure, eviction, losing everything he had built brick by brick, all because he offered a bottle of water to strangers. His phone buzzed, a text from his neighbor, Sarah, the one who'd left the note of support. "Come outside." He stepped out to find a small group waiting on his lawn, 5, maybe 6 people. They weren't loud. They weren't carrying signs, just neighbors, ordinary folks standing in quiet solidarity. One of them, an elderly man with a cane, spoke first. "We'll cover the fines, don't let them win." David's throat tightened. "No, I can't let you do that." But the man just shook his head. "You're fighting for all of us, don't think we don't see it." For the first time, David felt tears sting his eyes. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but the weight of kindness, the same kindness he had tried to give, now returned to him like a tide. Word spread fast. Within days, more people stopped by. Some dropped off water bottles for the cooler. Others left envelopes with cash to cover fines. The cooler had become more than a cooler. It was a symbol of rebellion, of humanity against bureaucracy. But the HOA saw it differently. At their next board meeting held behind closed doors, they decided to escalate. Not just fines, not just letters. They wanted to make an example of David. And so they filed paperwork, official, stamped, cold, the kind of paperwork that carried the weight of law. David didn't know it yet, but the fight was about to leave the cul-de-sac and enter the courtroom. Meanwhile, the cooler stood tall, 2 coolers now, sometimes 3. Every morning, David filled them. Every evening, they were empty. Strangers passing through the neighborhood snapped photos, posting them online with captions like, "This man gets fined for giving free water. How is this even real?" The story began to spread. Quietly at first, like whispers carried on desert winds, but whispers have a way of growing into storms. One evening, as the sky turned purple and cicadas screamed in the trees, David sat on his porch, sipping from a bottle of his own cooler. He stared at the horizon, heavy with worry, but somewhere deep inside, a flicker of pride glowed. They could fine him, threaten him, try to break him. But every empty bottle told the truth. He was making a difference. And what David didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this quiet desert battle was about to catch fire far beyond their neighborhood. The heat of the Arizona sun wasn't the only thing rising that week. David's story had leaked online. It started with a single post, A photo of him standing next to his cooler, paint-streaked garage in the background, violation slips scattered on the ground. The caption read, "Arizona man fined repeatedly for giving out free water to people in the heat." Within hours, hundreds of comments poured in. Some praised him, some raged at the HOA, a few were skeptical, asking, "Are you sure it's real?" But the story had legs, and legs in the age of the internet meant momentum. By the next day, the local news showed up. Cameras, microphones, flashing lights reflecting off the driveway where David had always quietly placed his bottles. He felt a strange mix of pride and terror. Pride that people were finally seeing what he had been risking. Terror because once a story goes public, it takes on a life of its own. The reporter leaned in, microphone trembling slightly. "Mr. Morales, why keep giving out water when the HOA fines keep piling up?" David's jaw tightened. He glanced at the coolers, still half full. Children had come by earlier, one clutching a bottle as if it were life itself. He thought of the mailman, the neighbors, the strangers who had smiled and thanked him. "Because," he said finally, "people need it. That's reason enough." The footage aired that evening and social media erupted. Hashtags appeared, Free Water Hero, #HOA vs David. Local blogs picked up the story. By morning, it had crossed state lines. People sent him messages of support, offers to help, and some, even money to pay the mounting fines. The HOA wasn't ready for this. Board members huddled behind closed doors, their calm facades cracking. Their small victories, the fines, the letters, the removed cooler, had been undone by one man's quiet courage and the power of a camera phone. They felt cornered, desperate, but pride prevented them from backing down. A letter arrived that day, not for David, but for the HOA, from an attorney representing concerned citizens. It demanded a halt to harassment, citing potential legal consequences if they continued to punish David for giving water. Inside David's small home, he read the scanned copy online, feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. But hope was fragile. The chairwoman of the HOA called a special meeting, demanding an emergency vote. "We cannot let him undermine our authority," she said, her voice sharp, echoing through the empty hall. "If we falter, everyone will see that rules mean nothing." Meanwhile, David continued filling the coolers. Every day. Sometimes he woke at 4 a.m., loaded them with ice and bottles, and placed them just before the sun rose. He was a man who didn't seek fame, didn't crave recognition, only survival for his neighbors, his community, and strangers who passed through their scorching desert. And every day more people came by, strangers who had read the story online, locals who had quietly supported him from the shadows. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Actions were louder than words. They refilled the coolers, cleaned the area, left small notes of encouragement. It became clear to David that this wasn't just about water anymore. It was about dignity. About standing up when something feels right, even when powerful forces tell you otherwise. But the stakes were rising. The fines had now surpassed $1,000. Legal threats loomed. And yet, for every shadow the HOA cast, the sunlight of support grew stronger, brighter, almost blinding in contrast. David had sparked a movement, not by planning it, not by seeking attention, but by refusing to turn away when the world needed a simple act of kindness. And as he watched the sun sink below the horizon, reflecting off the bottles in his driveway, he realized something profound. This wasn't a battle he had chosen, but it was a battle worth fighting. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures create the largest waves. The courtroom smelled of stale coffee, polished wood, and quiet tension. David sat in the back, hands clasped tightly, listening as lawyers in dark suits whispered strategy and lined up documents that seemed heavier than bricks. The HOA's attorney spoke first, voice calm but sharp, painting him as a rogue homeowner, someone who flouted community rules for attention. David's stomach twisted. Attention? He hadn't wanted any of this. He hadn't asked for cameras, reporters, hashtags, or strangers praising him. He had only wanted water to be there when someone needed it. The judge cleared his throat, peering over spectacles. "Mr. Morales, the Homeowners Association claims you have repeatedly violated community regulations and accrued fines totaling over $1,000. How do you plead?" David swallowed, voice steady. "Your Honor, I plead humanity." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Lawyers blinked. The judge leaned back, intrigued. He explained calmly, slowly, like he was teaching a lesson in compassion rather than arguing in a courtroom. The cooler wasn't a structure meant to defy rules. It was a lifeline, a simple gesture in a desert where the sun could kill in hours. He described children pedaling by, sweat-soaked mail carriers, elderly neighbors clutching bottles like medicine. Each example hung in the air, undeniable, heavy with truth. The HOA attorney countered. But rules exist to maintain order. If one person disregards them, chaos follows. David shook his head. Chaos doesn't follow kindness. Fear does when we punish it. Outside the courtroom, the crowd had grown. Supporters held signs, waved water bottles, chanted quietly. Cameras streamed live. The story had gone national. What started as a neighborhood skirmish had become a movement, a reminder that humanity mattered more than petty regulations. David noticed one thing that day. He wasn't alone. Faces he'd never seen before, strangers who had read the story online, were now standing with him. Their presence gave him a quiet strength. Every whispered thank you, every nod, every bottle someone held aloft reinforced a truth he had always known. Doing good often requires sacrifice, but it can inspire more than you imagine. The judge paused, reading documents carefully. This case is unusual, he admitted. On one hand, we have the authority of the Homeowners Association. On the other, there is clear evidence of a moral and communal benefit to the actions of Mr. Morales. There is tension here that cannot be ignored. David's heart pounded. He wasn't expecting mercy. He wasn't expecting sympathy. But he did want recognition of the principle. Sometimes the right thing is also the legal gray area. Then came the break. David stepped outside, sun hot on his face, and breathed in the crowd's energy. Supporters cheered quietly. A teenager handed him a cold bottle of water. "You saved me last week," he said simply. David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Hours later, back inside, the courtroom quieted for the final arguments. David's lawyer spoke with conviction. Rules are tools, yes, but they are not lawless shields to punish kindness. He asked the judge to consider intent, community benefit, and moral consequence, urging leniency or, better yet, dismissal. The HOA attorney pressed the opposite side, but even their voice sounded smaller now. The tide had shifted. People weren't just watching, they were judging. David sat silently, thinking about the desert, the long summer days, the bottles of water, the hands that took them, the hands that refilled them. He realized something profound. This fight had never been about money or fines. It had always been about something deeper: integrity, courage, and the courage to stand when everyone else is afraid. Finally, the judge leaned forward, pen hovering over the decision. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the sun outside seemed to pause. Because sometimes the smallest act, a cooler of water, a hand extended, becomes a battle that demands recognition, and the world, as strange as it is, notices. The news vans were parked in a neat row outside David's home before dawn. Cameras, microphones, and reporters crowded the sidewalk, their lenses pointed at the small driveway where the blue cooler stood. Someone had spray-painted "Hero" on a cardboard sign and propped it against the curb. Neighbors gathered, holding signs, waving water bottles, and whispering words of encouragement. Some were silent, simply standing in solidarity. Inside, David poured himself a bottle of water, watching through the window. His hands shook slightly, but not from fear. From the weight of it all, every eye was on him now. Every word he spoke, every move he made would be dissected, debated, and shared across screens nationwide. The HOA, meanwhile, was in chaos, their quiet authority shattered. Board members whispered heatedly in their office, papers scattered, phones ringing endlessly. They couldn't ignore the cameras. They couldn't silence the growing tide of support for David. And yet they tried: threats, letters, lies, statements to the press claiming he had disrupted community peace. But every word was met with skepticism. Social media had already decided whose side it was on. David stepped outside. The heat hit him like a wave, but he didn't flinch. He walked to the cooler, picked up a bottle, and handed it to a young boy in a baseball cap. The cameras caught it all, close-ups of his weathered hands, the boy's grateful smile, the sweat glistening on David's forehead. It was simple, but it carried a weight far heavier than any courtroom document. Then came the threats. A letter posted online, screenshots circulating on social media. Cease your actions or face legal repercussions beyond the HOA fines. David read it, eyes narrowing. They thought fear would bend him. They thought intimidation would silence him. But by now, he had learned something crucial. Kindness isn't fragile, it's resilient, and the world was watching. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom's decision from Part 6 had yet to be announced, but the court of public opinion had already spoken. Celebrities, local leaders, and even lawmakers began commenting. Emails poured in, calls, offers of support, donations, and legal advice. David felt both overwhelmed and vindicated. Neighbors continued to arrive. Some came with cases of water, others with food or blankets for those passing by on foot. The blue cooler had become more than a symbol. It was a hub of community resistance, a beacon of quiet rebellion against arbitrary authority. Inside the HOA office, panic was palpable. They debated removing the cooler by force. They considered escalating fines. They even talked about a lawsuit aimed at silencing David forever. But each option carried risk. Every action was now under scrutiny. Every misstep would be amplified. David, unaware of the internal chaos, refilled the cooler once again, glancing at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. The desert sky burned orange and purple. The air smelled of dust and promise. And then he realized the truth he had been feeling all along. This wasn't just about water. It was about courage, about standing up when rules collide with morality, about showing that one person can spark change, even when forces far larger try to suppress it. A reporter approached, microphone extended. "Mr. Morales, what would you say to the HOA if they were watching right now?" David smiled faintly, a mix of exhaustion and quiet defiance in his eyes. "I'd say kindness isn't against the law, and sometimes it's the only law we need." The words echoed through the streets, across the cameras, into living rooms everywhere. People repeated them, shared them, debated them. The story had grown larger than a neighborhood, larger than the fines, larger than any single person. And as David placed the last bottle back in the cooler, he knew the battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. Sometimes, the most ordinary people in the most ordinary neighborhoods become the catalysts for extraordinary change. The courtroom doors opened, and David stepped inside, the air thick with anticipation. This time it wasn't just a local case. Cameras from across the state, even national news, had turned the small Arizona dispute into a symbol. Every eye was on him, every whisper amplified, every movement captured. The blue cooler stood in the corner, a quiet witness to months of struggle, persistence, and courage. The judge cleared his throat, glancing at the documents before him. After reviewing all evidence and considering both the intent and the impact of Mr. Morales' actions, the fines are hereby dismissed. A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. The HOA's attorney's face flushed. The board members looked around, stunned, as murmurs spread like wildfire. David exhaled slowly, his chest loosening for the first time in weeks. Outside, supporters cheered. The street filled with neighbors, strangers, reporters, and those who had been touched by his simple act of kindness. People raised bottles of water in triumph. Cameras flashed, phones recorded. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. Free water hero David Morales, kindness wins. David looked at the coolers, still half full, and felt a wave of relief and pride. But more than that, he felt a deep sense of connection. Not just to those who had supported him, but to a simple truth he had held in his heart all along. Doing the right thing is worth it, even when the world seems against you. The HOA didn't disappear. They grumbled. Some left the neighborhood. Some stayed, but their authority had been shaken. The community, however, had changed. People spoke more kindly to each other. Strangers offered help. Children played freely under the Arizona sun, bottles of water in hand, the story of David Morales woven quietly into their lives as a lesson in courage. David's phone buzzed constantly that evening. Messages of gratitude, donations to cover the fines he had already paid, and notes of encouragement filled his inbox. One email stood out, from a young teacher in another state. "You've taught my students that one person can change the world by doing what's right." He smiled. The weight of months of struggle lifted slightly, replaced by a warmth that no fine, no threat, no paint could ever take away. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David sat on his porch. The desert was quiet except for the soft hum of cicadas. He held a bottle of water in his hands, cool against his skin, thinking about the journey, the threats, the fines, the whispers, the support, the courtroom, the cameras. He thought about the people who had taken bottles, who had refilled them, who had stood silently beside him. Sometimes, he realized, courage isn't loud. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet choice to do the right thing day after day, no matter the cost. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world notices. David looked up at the sky, stars beginning to pierce the fatting light. He knew the fight had changed him, and in a small, extraordinary way, it had changed the world around him too. Because kindness, persistent, fearless, and unassuming, had won. And as the desert night settled over his neighborhood, the coolers still full, and the streets quiet, David understood something profoundly simple. Sometimes giving a little water is the same as giving hope. And hope has a way of becoming unstoppable. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.